Hi, this is Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester. I'm here at the Andrews Community Forest to give you another weekly update on our progress here. As you know, it's been a little bit wet, so that slowed us down a little bit. We've been able to do some work in some dry areas, but the main skid trail leading between the woods and our log landing is pretty wet, so we've had to lay off it. Today, I'd love to talk to you about the type of forest management that we're doing out here. So the type of forest management that I practice and that I'll be practicing at Andrews is called ecological forest management. So ecological forest management is the idea that when we manage forests, we should manage them like they manage themselves. So we're managing them based on natural processes, based on the way that they change and develop if left to their own devices. Well, that may seem like an obvious concept. It hasn't always been the case. So a lot of trees are still grown in this country and across the world in systems like plantations, these very intensively managed systems which are designed not necessarily to mimic ecology, but to grow timber as quickly as possible. The difference between ecological forest management and traditional forest management is that instead of trying to manage forests solely for efficient growth of timber and economic value, we're managing them actively, but based on ecological processes, based on the way that they manage themselves. So what this looks like is not a forest that's neat and tidy, but actually a forest that looks really messy. And it looks that way intentionally. So for a long time, people spent a lot of time and energy and money in the woods trying to make forests look really neat and tidy without realizing that the expectation, our expectation of a forest that looks neat and tidy, maybe with nice evenly spaced trees, with all the brush neatly cut down and laying on the forest floor, has nothing to do with actual forest ecology or forest function. So one way that we can learn how forests naturally grow and develop over time, what forests that manage themselves look like, is by looking at old growth forests. So in New England, we know that prior to European settlement, we had around 55 to 60% of our forests were what we would call old growth forests, forests that have been around for more than 150 years. And that now we have less than 0.5%. So in Vermont, we think we have about 1,000 acres of old growth forest. However, in other parts of the region, in the Adirondack Park, places like that, we have a lot better examples. And so what we learn when we study these forests is that they look really different than forests that have been really intensively managed for timber in a few different ways. So number one, they have many different sizes and ages of trees. So we call this structural diversity, and that's something we're trying to actively encourage in the Andrews Community Forest by cutting trees in such a way that we're creating pockets of regeneration of new trees, and also creating opportunities for trees of all different sizes and ages to grow. Another thing that old growth forests have that traditionally managed forests don't is lots of dead wood on the ground. So dead wood has a lot of important ecosystem functions, and leaving dead wood, leaving tops of trees, and dead standing trees, snags, on the ground and standing, respectively, has a lot of really important ecosystem benefits. So at the Andrews Community Forest, I specifically have told the logger not to cut up tops and branches and to leave them exactly as they fall. And we're also leaving dead standing trees alone completely. The third thing that old growth forests have is canopy gaps. We talked about this in the last video. The canopy, which is not this sort of unbroken, flat, uniform thing, but is actually punctuated by these regular gaps of all different shapes and sizes, is very irregular. The fourth thing is big trees. So because of our land use history in Vermont, we don't have a lot of big trees in the way that we probably had about 300 years ago, but we understand that big trees have important ecosystem functions. And so in traditional forest management, a tree gets big, it's maxed out its maximum potential value, and you cut it down. Well, I think there's also room for leaving a lot of big trees in addition to cutting some big trees. And so we're specifically leaving trees to become big trees and to afford to the future all those myriad benefits of being big trees, and eventually to even become big dead trees. We call these biological legacy trees, and their function in the ecosystem as big trees and then as big dead trees is completely invaluable. So because most of Vermont's forests are relatively young, most of our forests are 60 to 100 years old, and almost all of them were clear-cut and pastured in the 1800s, we have forests which are relatively, compared to old growth forests, simple, which lack that structural diversity, which lack a lot of those features that we associate not just with old growth forests, but also with ecosystem health, with resilience, with all of these other attributes, wildlife habitat, with all these other attributes that we want our forests to be absolutely full of. And so one of the roles that people can play in our forests is by managing for what we call old growth attributes, these conditions that we find in old growth forests but we don't find in our relatively young forest, to manage for these attributes actively. So in the Andrews Community Forest, we're managing for structural diversity, we're managing for big trees, we're leaving lots of dead wood, and we're doing all of these things to create forest management which is not just getting timber out of the woods, not just harvesting a product, but is harvesting a product while managing a forest like it would manage itself, and helping our forest to be even more healthy, resilient, and diverse in the process.